All right. Well, it's really good to be here again. Thanks, Richard, for having me out to talk to you all again. It's actually really always a privilege for me to talk to ministers. I've had some opportunities in the last in the last year especially to talk with a group of pastors up in Landrum, a different piece of South Carolina, about the relationship between modern technology and the ministry. We got a grant from the Lilly Foundation at Davenant that's allowing us to pull in a bunch of pastors and talk about the impact of just digital technology on pastoral care. And apparently it's a very relevant thing. We've got a good crew there. And it's fun partially because if I had not gone into academics, one track might have been the ministry. I care a lot about people, and I'm very much appreciate the ministry and how it benefits people's lives. And so I'm really happy to be here to talk to you guys about these things today. Those of you who have engaged anything I've ever written, which shouldn't be most of you, and that's completely fine. There's other people to read out there that are more important than me. But those of you who've engaged anything I've written, as Richard just mentioned, know that I've done a lot of my work on the relationship between atheism, why atheism is plausible to a lot of contemporary people, sort of working with Charles Taylor's A Secular Age on that topic, and its relationship to contemporary technology and the question of divine absence. That is to say, a lot of what I've tried to do in my past work is ask the question of how does the modern technological order shape the imagination in such a way that atheism is rendered in some way more plausible to folks. And I'm actually just going to, for the first 4 or 5 minutes here, give a very, very, very brief summary of that, because as it turns out, I think this is just incredibly relevant to talking about the impact of the modern technological order on our understanding of people. Which is to say, I think the way you titled this, Richard, was something like the Imago Dei in technology. I'm missing it a little bit. But the idea that we're made in the image of God, that there's something significant about being a person, how does the modern technological order shape our imagination to even think about ourselves and think about our own nature? I think that's what I want to get at. And the way I'm going to get at it is proceeding with that more obvious question, that question of God. Last time I was here, if I were to smash down what I talked about last time I was here into 3 minutes, what I was trying to do is talk about how why it might have been plausible in the past that, and we were just talking about this over at lunch actually, why it might have been plausible in the past that somebody would have believed in God. That is to say, it would have been very, very difficult for somebody in the past, let's say a peasant in the Middle Ages in the year 1500, not to believe in God. And why, by contrast, in the year 2000 or 2024, is it the case that all of us in this room, who are presumably confessing Christians, or most of us, but Christians, most of you in the ministry, why is it that we can kind of faintly understand why somebody might not believe? That's the way Taylor sets up the question in A Secular Age. That reflects a big shift, you might say, in background noise. And what I presented last time I was here was effectively, I tried to look at kind of a three-legged stool in each direction. There was something about the way people in the past experienced nature, the way they experienced communities, and the way they experienced themselves, that made, as it were, God's obviousness in the mirror of those things. You might say God shined through quite clearly. And those same three things, what I argued, have changed significantly, and that has something to do with, you might say, the obscuring of the God signal, if you will. So what are those very basic things? Those very basic things are, in the past, the experience of most humans with nature itself, just being outside, weather, trees, grass, animals, etc., 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 was very stubborn. Nature is a collection of agencies acting upon you. That is what the world feels like to most of the world, actually, outside of the modern technological order. But there's a stubborn insistence of actors, you might say, on you in the natural order. That is to say, its active quality is very prominent. And you could say the same thing in a community. Most people have lived in communities that are fairly small, but where the roles are very, very clear. And especially, this is quite important, where my own role role within the community is very clear. That doesn't mean I have to like it. It doesn't mean that I like my job or what I do or anything like that. But I know why I go outside 12 hours a day. Well, it's because if I don't and I don't plant these things, we're all going to die. And that's a very, very concrete reason to do things. And so a long-winded way of putting those three stools together, something about nature, something about the community, something about ourselves, is just the word agency. The agency of the world, the agency of the people around me, and my own agency shine very loudly in the previous order. And what you might say then is that refracted through the mirror of so much act, what is there at the bottom of it all but some actor? And so medieval people didn't believe in the existence of God because they understood Aquinas' 5 proofs, right? That's not most of us still don't understand Aquinas' 5 proofs. This book here is pretty helpful if you want to try and figure them out. But there was something more visceral and basic about reality itself that made it such that it was just very difficult not to think God existed. Something basic that we can call God existed. Contrast that to the modern context where nature's still there, but that tree is just a pretty green thing outside the window to me right now. I don't have to deal with it. I drove from Landrum in an automobile to get here today, 100 and something miles this morning, and I just plowed through forests. And I did not have to think about them at all. Thousands and thousands of trees that I don't have to worry about at all. If the sun goes out at night, I have these things that can, the world is still acting, but I don't have to attend to it because I've papered over, I've put a bubble over, and I'm not even saying this is bad. Nevertheless, it's just the sense of the insistence of things upon me is a bit obscured. And you could then move to the community. The capacity in the last 100 years, especially after the era of the automobile, is such that you actually can live a fairly economically successful life. You can live a whole life and actually not depend very much or be in great communion with neighbors or with bodies. You can live pretty isolated and make it okay. And I'll put that in quotation marks. But the point is, you're not as dependent. The agency of others is not something you have to deal with, at least as immediately as perhaps in former circumstances. And then finally, even in our own activity, people talk in modern labor systems. Maybe I work 60 hours a week, but how many people, you all are pastors, and so you probably have to deal with this all the time. How many people come into the office and they work 60 hours a week, but they don't know what they do? And they don't know why they're doing it, and they don't know how it plugs into the community, and they don't know. All I know is that I press a button in some assembly line or something like that, but how does this actually plug into meaningful act out there? And so there's these identity crises over the very meaning of my own activity. And so people in modern literature can talk about being carried along, as it were, in their own labor, being passengers in their own activity. And so you might say the agency of the world obscured, the agency of the community obscured, and your own agency obscured. What does the world look like in the mirror of all that? But agentless all the way down. And perhaps this is why you can have this juxtaposition of knowing that these arguments work in the mind, but then why does reality still feel this way? Putting those two things together. Right, very basic summary of a lot of stuff I write about God. I'm in the middle of writing another book right now, trying to take that same notion, I suppose, and that analysis of modernity, and then work through the rest of the Christian faith. Say, well, how does this? How is God not simply obscured for us? But what about man? What about salvation? What about the scriptures? What about? And kind of work through the creed and take that same, I guess, rhetorical voice, you might say, and work through particulars. And so when Richard asked me to come and talk about this, it was kind of interesting because one thing that I've been appreciating more and more after I wrote that, and I've been working on a new project, is the way in which all those, the obscuring of God is also part of an obscuring of our own nature. The loss of some visceral sense of God goes alongside some loss of a visceral sense of who we are. And if you think of those three categories, that might already begin to make sense. We'll come back to them a little bit later, especially in discussion time. But what do we lose in knowing ourselves and in a sense of human nature when nature itself is lost for us, or when the community is lost for us, or obscured at least, or when our own activity it's unclear to ourselves what we're doing. What does human nature look like, as it were? Not just what does God look like in the mirror of those questions, but what does human nature look like in the mirror of those experiences? Anecdotally, it's obvious that human nature has seen hard times since the Industrial Revolution. Not only have we increasingly found ways to remake and craft our bodies. We can think of transhumanist movements here. Those are the obvious ones. We can also think of tendencies, even though I am a son of my mother, but I'm not totally against tattoos. Nevertheless, you can kind of see maybe there's a growth in almost treating the body as a kind of canvas, right? There's a kind of self-making quality in a lot of the way that we treat our bodies. A certain mentality where I become a blank slate for self-making, something like that. Not only have we increasingly found ways to remake and craft ourselves, but we're doing that at the same time that we've ceased to believe there's a human nature in the first place. So it's interesting, the loss of God is also in 20th century movements philosophically and socially, you might say. There's also a movement that basically says, what is human nature? Maybe there isn't one. The loss of God and the loss of human nature philosophically most certainly go together in the 20th century. But it's interesting, you see these tendencies to kind of self-crafting and self-making at the very same time as you sort of see a loss of what do these things mean in the first place? An obvious application of that beyond, transgenderism or transhumanism or something like that is just the more basic world of gender. One of the things that and Ivan Illich will point out about the history of the conflict between the sexes is that a lot of the contemporary tension between the sexes is not really the result, as much as it's portrayed very often this way, the result of necessarily some historic patriarchy, but rather a lot of the tensions are part of simply the post-industrial order. What happens in households, because formerly you had men and women working together, and they might have done different things, but actually most men and women have historically lived alongside each other in a productive household. What you see after the Industrial Revolution is this phenomenon of people going to work outside the home and then coming back. And that recreates the relationship between the genders, and a lot of contemporary gender tension is actually, at least according to Illich, a fallout of that sort of thing. But what you can imagine, I'll come back to some of that. Sorry, I'm talking too fast. I'm going to slow down here. So anecdotally, we can see that human nature has fallen on hard times. So I want to get to something more specific about this. The difficulty is that the three things I just mentioned are sort of how we typically, as I mentioned already, are sort of how we discover who we are. Classically, it's in encountering the world, and especially other persons, that I discover my own self. So, you think about the basic structure of human consciousness. It's not actually that you're conscious and then there's a world. Your first moment of awareness is awareness of a world that's there. Some of the older doctors might say, there's a co-relativity between your mind and the world. Your awareness just is a receptacle of the world, and the world was made for you to shine out into you might say. It's classically in the world that we realize our own awareness, and especially in the small worlds, the small receptacle worlds that are other persons. It's a commonplace of both the philosophical and the Christian tradition to speak about friends as though they are our second selves. What are friends? But they're kind of they in whom I actualize. They're a second. They're other than me, but there's a second me in them of sorts that gets into me just as I get into them, because we deeply shape each other. Our friends are our second selves. The question becomes, how much did direct perception of our own natures and personalities in most historical arrangements of things involve some negotiation with the world, with the community, and with ordinary paths of self-possession for the common good? That is to say, the evaporation of those things, does that tacitly become increasingly the loss of our nature. Not just that, here's one way of putting it, it's not just that philosophy comes along and gets rid of a concept of human nature, and that's why we don't believe in human nature anymore. Are the things that actually activated our nature, the things that have evaporated, such that now almost all we have sometimes, or feel that we have, is some theory to attach to. Think of that, I'll move on here in a second, but think about that relative to gender. There's a million books written every year about how to be a biblical man and how to be a biblical woman, and it suggests, it's kind of funny, we often talk about like how disoriented the world of gender out there is, and it is, but the fact that there's such a cottage industry of how to be a biblical man and a biblical woman suggests that we are disoriented as well. And one of the things that I think that, one of the things I'm trying to emphasize there is, in a lot of history, the things that made gender theory work was not gender, well, it was just that. It wasn't theory. Men and women, when your life is so concrete and you just do have to chop down a tree, well, the person with bigger muscles is going to chop down the tree. It's not a negotiation. It just is. The moment we start talking about complementarianism, and I'm not against complementarianism, but notice what it is. It's put it up here. It's now a thing that I consciously think about and point to. And the Bible's always, men and women have always existed, and the Bible's always given instruction to men and women because we need it. But it was never a theory. That's over complementarianism versus egalitarianism, and you can kind of see what's going on there. There's a loss of the gravitational elements of these things that just make it be that boys and girls show up this way in the real world. When the forces that historically kind of forced that out of us, you might say, begin to free float, we tend to become oriented through the mind. We tend to think like, well, I don't have where's my instincts? And the world isn't reinforcing this. Well, how do I get oriented? Well, I go to a spreadsheet, as it were. I get the ideas, and then I try to enact them on the ground. We'll talk about that a little bit more in a bit. Not only is the loss of a certain gravitational pull, is there a loss of a certain gravitational pull relative to our nature? That's just a long-winded way of saying not only have we lost some of the contexts in which human nature shows up, you might say, there's also the pedagogical effect of the modern technological order itself. That is to say, not only are we untrained to speak about human beings in one way, but we are trained to speak about them in another way, and one very consistent with projects of self-making. That sounds esoteric, but I think we'll be able to make it concrete by the end. Where I'm going with that is I want to say, this is the question I want to ask really for the rest of the lecture is, in what way is technology training us to think about human beings? I think this is really the vein in which I want to think about the question of the image of God today. Go back to that gender analogy for a second. In what way can you have a perfect theory of complementarianism and completely lose a gravitational attachment to like the nature of gendered reality itself? That's the kind of thing I want to get at. In what way could we define the image of God perfectly clearly? Maybe we're very good at saying, okay, the trans movement has lost human nature and you got to recover Aristotle and form and matter and gender is the first accident of blah, 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 because Thomas Aquinas. There's a whole bunch of data I can recover to kind of fight the loss of human nature. But what if you haven't even seen the way in which you have a distorted relation to human nature, almost an imaginative structure relative to human nature that's not gotten to simply by correcting your theory? That's really where I'm going here. We're aware of all sorts of low-hanging fruit ways in which we might have lost some sense of human nature. And again, there I'm thinking of transgender movements and body mod movements and all that sort of thing. But there's something deeper too and prior to this that I hope we can get at. And so what I'm going to do for a few minutes here is, because I'm going to drink this here. My training is mostly as a philosopher, and so we're gonna have like a 10-minute philosophy lesson for a second here, and think about how some very serious thinkers have tried to define modern technology, and then get at the question of how does technology shape us. So I'm tasked with sort of technology in the image of God. The way I want to look at that is not to look at any particular technology. And this is, I'm drawing here upon Jacques Ellul and Martin Heidegger. Jacques Ellul, of course, writes his famous Technological Society in the 60s. Also famous because it was read by the Unabomber. He got the wrong idea, but, right, so the Technological Society. And then Martin Heidegger is famous for a smaller essay he wrote just called The Question Concerning Technology. And there's a very significant overlap between what Heidegger is doing and what Ellul is doing. What both of them, I mean, these are famous theorists of modern technology, and what both of them walk away with saying is something to this effect. The essence of technology is nothing technological. When we're trying to say, how does technology impact us? When we ask that question, okay, the world, just there's so much technology everywhere. There's street lamps and lights and cars and planes and you can just name it. The internet, VR and all that stuff. My kids tell me about new technologies all the time, and I'm already old and I can't keep up with it. But nevertheless, there's just this massive aggregate of things. How does technology, we just threw it all in one big word, technology, how does that shape us? Heidegger and Ellul both try to get to something deeper and principial in this. The way Ellul puts it is, technology affects us through incubating in our consciousness the mentality of technique. So what is a technological society? It's not a society where there's just a bunch of technology out there. Of course there's a bunch of technology out there, but it's a society where the mentality of technique has sunk deep down and incubated in the consciousness of its members. And what does that mean? Effectively, you could look at it as sort of an instrumentalizing posture. When I walk around in the world, and I have been trained to kind of move things out of the way, when I walk around the world and everything has been tailored for convenience, or tailored in such a way that I don't have to deal with anything in one sense. What's going on? I'm severely reducing. It's a big book, but I'm severely reducing Ellul here a bit. But effectively, what he's trying to argue is that this kind of pragmatic, technical, bureaucratic mentality develops in your consciousness that you move around and you begin to code your own life. People, the solution to practical problems, the solution to church problems, et cetera, wink, wink. You begin to incubate a way of just approaching the world, a way of approaching people, a way of approaching communities that makes you after the image of what you're attending to. If the technological gaze, as it were, sees the world as resources to make convenient, as it were, and that mentality grows in you in such a way that it almost suffocates by habit, not even by intention, but by habit, suffocates any other way of looking at things. What you might come up with, yes, is a circumstance in which everything you look at is looked at technically. All the mentality you bring is technique, means and ends. Heidegger makes a similar argument. He argues that the essence of technology, he says, is nothing technological. And of course it's Heidegger, and so he says everything in a super weird way with a lot of hyphens and so on. I'll try and reduce it down. But effectively, he says what technology does is it causes human beings to, he uses this term enframing, to enframe everything as standing reserve. Oh, well, that was clear. Okay, let's make it clear. Okay. And frame everything as standing reserve, meaning available energy to do what I want. So a good example would be something like, this is a terrible example, but you can use a human being as a chair. A human can get on all fours, and I suppose you could sit on one, but it's a very bad use of a human being. It would be much better to use that thing as a chair than a human being. In a sense, what Heidegger wants to say is this is what technology does with everything, right? Is it stares out, and we've been so enframed to think, what can I do with this? That its nature it's speaking for itself as what it is kind of obscured, and everything becomes, as it were, data, resources, for an end that I impose on things. And what you might argue is that what's going on in our posture toward one another and toward nature, et cetera, is that we're deeply shaped to see things in an instrumentalizing way. I mean, it's a very similar point to Ellul, but it's not just see things in an instrumentalizing way. It's not instrumentalizing, but almost developing a cognitive inability to see something as an actor in and for itself before it is an actor in and for some program I might have in my head, some algorithm that it fits into or doesn't fit into. That's what he's going to argue technology as a thing is doing to our mentality in general. What you see in both of those thinkers is an attempt to look at the whole technological order and to see how it's pulling, how what it causes is this deep incubation, not just in our thoughts, in terms of, now it is in our thoughts, but it's something deeper than even our conscious thoughts, just at our level of social habits. And really, you might say, at the level of basic imagination, at the level of how we even begin to frame things. And they both think that a lot of that's carried along in the way that we learn to talk about ourselves. I can't tell you the amount of times I read articles, maybe you guys do this too. I find myself saying things sometimes like, "My brain is tired." And that's my brain is not tired. I am tired. My brain is not, it's a different thing. And now this is an example that could be multiplied endlessly, but actually there's a lot of subtle ways in which we talk that are very, very imprecise on this score because we have been trained to think technologically about ourselves or mechanistically about ourselves. And it's shocking how much this kind of thing gets in language. I'm going to read you a passage that has gives a similar example. Let me see if I can find it. Death of a Salesman. People of Willy Loman, Death of a Salesman, were aware of this. Arthur Miller. This is from a book called Born Losers, A History of Failure in America, which very interesting topic if you're looking at talking about a history of American failure, not something we take very well in our civilization. I find this section fascinating. A century and a half ago, we embraced business as the dominant model for our outer and inner lives. Ours is an ideology of achieved identity. Obligatory striving is its method, and failure and success are its outcomes. We reckon our incomes once a year, but audit ourselves daily by standards of long-forgotten origin. Who thinks of the old counting house when we take stock of how we spend our lives, take credit for our gains, or try not to end up third rate or good for nothing? Someday we hope the bottom line will show that we amount to something. By this kind of talk, we balance our whole lives, not just our accounts. Willy Loman speaks this way. Choosing suicide to launch his sons with insurance money, he asks, "Does it take more guts to stand here the rest of my life ringing up a zero?" He insists that a man is not a piece of fruit to be eaten and the peel discarded, but he does not see that a man is not a cash register. I'm using that as an example of this kind of thought experiment that an Ellul and a Heidegger are trying to get us to see. The way that we talk, like, it's so funny. I say all that stuff. I've said all that stuff a million times, and I don't think about it at all. But it carries along an implicit construal of the world imaginatively that is deeply shapes ministry, shapes parenting, shapes community structures, it shapes the way you self-relate, it shapes an enormous amount of things. I suppose what I want to, I don't, Richard, I didn't look at my time. Oh, wow, I've already been talking for 40 minutes. My children would tell you that's probably a frequent flaw of mine to make a point and have it stop for 40 minutes. I suppose what I want to do, I'll say a couple more things, and then I'd love to turn this into a discussion, because one of the things that I'm really interested in is how does this mentality shape the way that we approach, now I say we, I'm not a minister, but how does it shape the way we approach, or y'all, I suppose, approach something like ministry? I can think of this from the standpoint of, I've been part of the Davenant Institute, and I've seen the way that we relate to each other, and some of this has become very, very relevant. So here's an example. I remember seeing a pastor come into a church, and some people left when he came to the church. And somebody approached the pastor, and they were like, some people are leaving, and that's concerning to me. And the pastor said something to the effect of, when a new pastor comes in, people leave. And that's true. That's not false. I doubt there's ever a situation of kind of pastoral transition where some new people don't come, some people don't go. But it was an interesting response in that it was just, there was a kind of math to it. It was like, I'm new, you do new things, people go. That's just life. And it was a very interesting way of just coding what a church is and what a community is, what church membership is, even, what it meant that those people went there, or what your job is relative to the community. There's a million encodings in even a small exchange like that. And so one of the things I suppose I'm really interested in hearing back from you all or talking through with you all is just the how can that sort of notion, that instrumentalizing posture, that a person, again, not that obscure. We're all very clear. There's human nature, and we're not supposed to do trans things. Yay. That's apparently that was a hard one to figure out. But there's something deeper about recovering human nature and actually relating to a human being that's beyond being able to define a human being well. And I guess the contention I'm giving is maybe we've been maltrained as a civilization at that more basic level. And how does that affect the ministry? I suppose that's what I'm really wanting to talk about. So I'm just going to throw it out to you guys, I guess, at this point. Go ahead.
Question?
Yeah.
So in your reading, have you found that there is an era that would have been more holistic? It's like, I think they were doing this right. Obviously, instrumentality is always an issue for every generation, for any issue that they face.
Yep.
But it seems like we're unbalanced or misbalanced somehow in the whole of how we think about ourselves and how we think of the world. So is there an era that you can look back and say, or that Alol or someone else could look back at and say, this seems like a more balanced time period for this particular?
Yeah, that's a good question. My own sense is that, typically, anytime I've read the history books, it's more like the problems are just different, and they're both good and terrible in their own ways. Certainly, using people is as old as sin. And so instrumentalizing another person, that's just, and that's in some sense the entire thug world of the ancient Near East is just who wins, who has more power. So in one sense, a lot of history works like this, or at least this is present in a lot of history. What I think they would argue is different is that it becomes such almost an invisible code of human act and interpretation itself, that the instrumentalizing gaze becomes almost the very DNA of just how you experience the world and people, rather than a thing that somebody elects to, rather than the thug electing to take up, I will now go use people, that sort of thing. And so that the juxtaposition between the two headspaces is less prominent. Maybe that's one way of putting it. So is it, I would never want to, I'm very, very reticent to ever be the guy that's like, back in that day, it was balanced. It might have just been differently misbalanced. But I think we can name the way in which we're misbalanced, basically. Yeah. Oh, yeah, go ahead.
On that note, are you familiar with Philip Reef's work on private therapeutic?
Yeah, just a little, yeah.
I guess the economic man, which he characterizes the 19th and early 20th century, which kind of goes to your illustration about business and money being primary. But then he says there's a shift in the shadow of Freud toward therapeutic man, which he says the whole point of life is an instrumentality to sweeten the time.
Yes.
That's how he frames it. Would you agree with that?
Yeah. Oh, yeah. There's and that. Yeah. It's interesting to see that Originally, the goal of therapy was to recognize that somebody had like a genuine neurosis, right, that made them kind of not fit for society. And it was to kind of minister to the neurosis to get them back to the norm. Whereas now it's more like, oh, the crazy thing you feel, well, actually, I guess we are all crazy. So let us change the whole of society so that the thing you're starting with is actually normal. Right, or that's overstating it, obviously, but right, there's an instrumentalization at that point, not only of the whole person's life to their comfort or to their not having to face various things, but an instrumentalization of the whole of society, actually, for that goal in them. If you guys haven't read this, Tara Isabella Burton's book, Strange Rites, The New Religions of a Godless Age, is very, very, very good on this. And she almost talks about the, in kind of Gen Z public religion in modern America, you almost have the Pharisaical duty to indulge yourself. Or I don't remember exactly how she put it, but there's this odd mix of almost Pharisaism with this seemingly complete kind of self-indulgent side of things, which is fascinating to see put together. Yeah, go ahead.
So you talk about this shift and how we start to view everything as tools and resources to ends that we impose on the world. And my question is, to what extent, if any, do you think that's a negative shift? Because what I initially think too is opening chapters of Genesis where the Lord tells Adam to take dominion of the earth and to subdue it. And as I look at technology, our ability to, say, subdue the temperature in this room, to subdue the rain that comes down on our head, the forest you drove through, that seems greatly increased. But yet at the same time, there then seems to be this shift that we suddenly seem to act as though we are the only agents, and that we're now the only ones acting on the world as if there were no God of the world. So to what extent do you think this change in a deep instrumentalization of everything we see as positive or negative, maybe it's neither, and just how do we think through this?
Yeah, that's an excellent question. And I think the basic, it's not, I mean, in many ways it's good, in many ways you could call it problematic. I think one way of thinking through it, classically, I think the sense would be, who am I thinking of here that probably gets at this in a theoretical way? Well, Christopher Alexander, For the Life and Beauty of the World. I think that's the name it's called. Christopher Alexander, his works. But yeah, classically, I think what you would want to say is like of course, you cut trees down and you build houses and you have indoor electricity and all that sort of thing. The question becomes, how is that related to place? How is it literally related to soil? How is food related to place? Technology is, in Scripture, and really for human beings, historically a good thing. But it's seen also as a development and working with, as it were, the grain of things, you might say. People talk about cutting along the grain of things as opposed to against the grain of things. And so you could think of the original technology in one sense as gardening, right? It's like a garden is not a forest. A garden cuts down, you weed, you take a bunch of stuff out. And God, in that sense, is the first technology maker. But what is a good gardener doing but playing with things in such a way, just like with a child. A child's not merely an instrument, though that's one way in which people definitely code people instrumentally as kids. But what are you doing with a child is actually taking an innate movement of growth and you're cultivating and parenting it, husbanding it, basically. And you're doing the same thing in a garden, and you could say the same thing writ large of technology in making a city, which is why in a lot of cases, for instance, park movements in cities are probably some recognition that it would be kind of weird to just knock nature over, not just for the human psyche, because humans need to see green, but you want to honor the very shape of things, as it were, in the making of cities, and then it's also a balance thing in the sense of, I'm not like I don't have like massive environmental theories or something like that. I don't get too involved in those disputes. But the idea that if you're using some resources in the world, replacing them, right? The idea is not so much that you can't chop down trees, but that it's good that trees exist and we want lots of them. It's okay to eat animals, but but the population of animals should exist. And so there's, kind of the notions of overfishing and over this and over that. The instrumentalizing posture, of course, isn't just about taking too much of things. It's about, you might say, cutting against the grain of things. In other words, what if I took a tomato plant and said, you need to produce grapes? And then it's like, maybe there's some really weird way in which you could make it do that. But when you keep doing that to things, you lose, in a sense, the world itself, because it all becomes something you've put on it, and that's almost all you're relating to at some point. And so I think a huge question is really not whether we're going to do technology, of course we are, but is it a technology that is working with the grain of things versus against it? And is there an eyeball on the kind of, and again, I'm thinking of this in the broadest sense, but the kind of the whole ecology of things versus just, the immediate payoff of something. If that makes any sense.
So I think that one of the ways it's particularly important or relevant for pastors is just the idea of the care of souls. You have the ancient book by Gregory the Great, the Book of Pastoral Rule, which when you read that, it seems almost foreign, like a foreign language. And then a Lutheran pastor wrote a book recently, The Care of Souls, and I remember reading the opening chapter and just thinking, for first 25 years of my life, I heard nobody in ministry talk like this about the care of souls. And then you have someone like Mark Dever who says about his book, 9 Marks, these are just all the things the Bible says churches should do. There's really nothing new in this book. It's just that the American church doesn't do them.
Yep.
Right?
Yep.
And so I think this goes to the issue of when you see these clips of megachurches on the internet and what they're doing, you just get the sense that they're not malicious in what they're doing. They have just been so formed by a technological instrumental world that they have turned church into this machine, right?
Yep.
And it's so far away from the care of a person's soul. And then the last thing would be, it seems Augustine's distinction between use and enjoyment seems very relevant.
Yes.
Here, because the other issue about, well, shouldn't we subdue the world? It's like, yeah, but you don't subdue human beings.
Yep.
Right? So you use some things, you enjoy others, and there's some things you treat differently even within the world.
Humans are never merely means.
Right.
They're always, yes, humans are always ends. Yeah, that's a use versus enjoyment in Augustine. Yeah, that's an important distinction on this score. And what you mentioned about churches and mega churches, one of the things I've seen even in PCA churches, I won't name names, but one of the things I've seen in churches is I remember being a part of a church where a pastor came in, and he was a good man, a church planter personality. That's what he did historically. But he came into a fairly established church, and again, good dude. But I think there was a way in which the whole church felt within a year or two of him being there that like he'd walk down the halls and it was like, Terminator, possible deacon, oh, that guy can do this, that. And there was just this sense that like he came in with he wanted to do things and people, and he wanted to have the ideas, and he was constantly kind of frustrated because he saw this room full of people that he could get things done with, and nobody was that inspired to do it because, of course, you guys are ministers. This never works. That's not how it goes down. And what was interesting was there was already a ton of ministry going on at the church that he did not inspire. There were couples that would take their dog to the old folks' home every weekend, and because an old folks' home and a dog, walking your dog in an old folks' home is you're going to make a lot of people really happy. And they did that once a week. And that was kind of obscured because it was what is the beep boop? What is the program we need to fill out? Who is going to do it? And then you lose what's actually there. And so people are not only discouraged because they're not really doing what the pastor wants, but they're actually not encouraged for what they're already doing, for the ministry they're already doing. And that's a kind of example where I can think of almost an approach to the ministry there can be an approach to the ministry that's also very kind of technological, like the way that I imagine what it is to have a vision for my church, for instance. Oh yeah, go ahead.
I've always thought there's a correlation between how the Christian, so just speaking about Christians, not general population, how they approach and view God and the faith, and then how that reflects how they view the image of God in people.
Yep.
Being such that, okay, if you're not taught as a Christian to adore God for who He is, if that's not part of the work rule of your prayer and praise, day in, day out, week in, week in, week out, then you're not taught to see people as who they are. Because you end up kind of devolving into, well, I go to worship to get something out of it, to go to the Bible to learn, to get something, to gain knowledge, or to gain wisdom. I pray to God for a transaction,
Yep.
rather than learning just to adore God. If you don't adore God just for who He is,
Yep.
you don't get anything out of that, then you're not going to see people for who they are.
Yeah, I think that's a really, one thing that we could spend all afternoon talking about is also the way that we, as it were, technologize God. And you can imagine a certain theological approach that's sort of like, well, I've got all of my theology correct, and so God has become a spreadsheet a little bit. And I think you're right. Then people are going, if the incomprehensible God is comprehensible by puny you, then so are puny humans, I guess. And it's like, but there is an idolatry in that. And unless God is so much bigger, and that's what adoration is He's so much bigger than anything I've contained in me, and it's posturing yourself before that. People are like that too. There's something infinite about the human soul, and I don't mean that sentimentally. I mean that very technically, and sentimentally. Humans are cool. Oh yeah, go ahead.
So I had to read a little for one of my PhD classes.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, thank you for making him understand. Because I read him and I just felt lost. However, I do remember thinking as he was trying to, again, push in different ways, how technique means the use of all things instrumentally, rather than relationship, and especially people, that being a minister on a multi-staff, I am the minister of counseling. Is that a technique-inspired role? Hey, you're the guy who has particular training in counseling, and whenever I end up being the pastor of weird and awkward.
Yes.
Whenever there's somebody that the pastoral staff doesn't want to have to deal with that's weird and awkward,
Yes.
they go, send in the squire.
Yes.
Right?
Yes. Yes.
Is that in some way leading into, in a negative sense, this sense of technique? So that when I see people, sometimes I only see the negative, them grieving or them confused or whatever.
Right.
And then they're with my discipleship minister and they're on the golf course having fun.
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
We see two completely
Yes.
different sides.
Just the compartmentalized care of souls. Yes. Yeah. Yes.
Not talking about
Yes.
that.
It's the care of souls department. Yes. Yes. We do different rooms. That's right.
So as I've thought about it, I keep going back and forth, and I guess this is where I'd be really interested in your thoughts or thoughts of anybody. You're like, in one hand, it's like, should we be more holistic here? Should I just be one of 6 pastors on staff without this is what you do?
I think so. It's hard to. I can't answer that in the abstract, only because, like, in principle, the origin of that model might have been the absorption of that mentality. It might be that the language that we use to talk about it reflects a little bit of that, but then everything is really going to come down to what is actually going on with people. And this is the thing I see in institutions is very often, I worked at UT Dallas while I was doing my PhD. I was the secretary in the math department to have a job while I was doing completely non-math over there. It was an absolutely massive bureaucracy, 30,000 students, everything you could say about an admin heavy wing, everything that I've been talking about, it was just that in spades. But there were always ways to you can see pockets of not that because human beings can always transcend that. And so to me, it's mostly like what actually happens in an individual church organically that is really the answer to whether we've taken a wrong turn here somewhere. And very often you can kind of play systems against themselves a little bit. I don't mean against the group, but I mean, sometimes we inherit a title, and it's kind of like, yeah, but what is this thing really? Well, it's that, and you can kind of play it out in a way that doesn't have these problems. It could be, I mean, it could be the kind of thing that creates problems like that, but I don't, again, to me, it's all about how it actually plays out on the ground. Yeah.
I think the challenge is one, I think that the Eastern theological and philosophical framework by which we are rooted in, now in contrasting to a westernized, systemic, almost functionalistic type framework that we operate in. And so I think it's the consistent contrasting of those two worldviews, elements coming back together. Because I think I know we were walking through, we have a missions pastor, right? And so having missions function in somewhat of a silo, operational, tactile role. And we're like, brother, the problem is that we've siloed this, and really missions, instead of being its own silo, really runs across all of these areas.
Right.
So in every area, and I think, for Squire's sake, I think he needs more golf balls and less tissues. I think David should flip it, but
Thank you.
I can just come talk to my session. But I do think that, I think there is the benefit of a gardener with a hoe and a planter with a seed, and they all are holistically functioning in a collective union of seeing the growth and cultivating a space where that can happen.
Yep.
All of those elements, and whether our organizational structure and all those things are more functionalistic because of the worldview and the structure, the context, and the cultures that we live in. I think it's to see it's whether or not the unity inside of the body functioning for its sole purpose is fulfilled. And so that's why I wholeheartedly, because I came from the big mega church, 16,000 people, 127 staffers, and I freaking hated it. And now guys on my staff who now they probably hate the way I do it. So it's just part of it.
Circle of life.
It is. I know that they get to say it sucks now. I don't get to it's awesome. It's great for me,
Yeah, I think a ton of this is.
I think it's a both and, not a either or.
Sure.
That's where that Eastern-Western kind of worldview clash of our philosophical, theological framework really does come into contention.
Yep.
Of what we're walking through.
Yeah, the tension I think would be very if and again I'm not a pastor. If I were a pastor, I think the tension of course, famous words, right? Oh, you think exactly. But so much of what has made a lot of the issues we have, even this kind of compartmentalization of staffing and whatever, is just the modern church around the automobile, right? When you lose the local parish church, you are doing a different thing. Church is just a different project, and that's most churches now. Once you lose the parish church, what a minister is, and especially if a bunch of people come to this church, the mega church is only possible because the 500-member church is possible, or the 300-member church where most of the members are driving in. The community, so to me, a huge part of what the priority of a church in one sense is, most churches aren't actually old-style community churches, but we can intentionally, and this is the hard thing, is it doesn't happen naturally anymore. You can nevertheless intentionally, and I think that's the tension. And then the question is how much pressure, because you got to be realistic with people's lives and whatever, and you don't want to become a Pharisee about it and make it annoying to go there. But the idea is, what are ways in which a sense of the local, and maybe this is something that happens between churches, but the sense of the real local grows. And I think once you have a sense of the community that is involved in each other's lives and that sort of thing, that's also where it's in one sense, it's almost like you also just want your life to be around the people. So it's not just like I'm going to meetings with them, whether to golf or to this. It's also just that like I'm near them. And classically speaking, the church was a place where people did life together. And that's hard.
Anglicans were allowed to say amen. This section over here would be amen.
Yes. No, but it's, they say it, yeah. The lack of parish, and the difficulty is that it does have to be recovered in the modern world intentionally. And I go back to gender with that, right? It's like we just are a little bit disoriented from gender, but that doesn't mean gender doesn't exist. But it does mean that it takes some intentionality to actually know what orientation looks like. So it's not bad that there's a book out there trying to help you be oriented. Nevertheless, that's not the only thing. You want internalized principle, and yet we need some external orientation. And I think the same thing with community. There's some intention involved in it, and yeah.
I appreciate you going back to that tri-legged stool, because I do think it kind of goes back into the nature, community, and the self. It kind of all ties.
They all, yeah. Once. I mean, church is different after once you don't have a household economy. Everybody works. That assumes the automobile. I mean, one person asked Carl Trueman one time, what was the most impactful moment in the history of the Christian church? And I think without skipping a beat, he said something like the invention of the Model T Ford in 1907. Church is different after the automobile. And again, that's not bad, but a lot of the things that we're talking about, I think really, there's just some basic DNA that makes it different than in the past. And so it's figuring out the equilibrium really where we are that I think is really the challenge.
Well, let's end on time, and then I can talk to Joe a little after if you want. Thank you.
No, thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thank you.